Welcome to this last part of today's lecture, in which we'll briefly discuss the reading for today, namely this highly influential paper by Antonio Rangel, Colin Camara, and Reid Montague. In this paper, they propose a model for how the brain may be involved in making decisions. And this has really influenced our thinking, or the thinking of the field, in many ways. So let's go through this. And I also recommend you to do read this paper, because it's actually a very nice paper that summarizes many of the different ideas that circulate still until today within neuroeconomics. So at the very basis, the authors propose that a decision should involve these 5 steps. At minimum, obviously, there can be additional steps that can play into this. So at the lowest level, the level of representation, when we make a decision, we have to be able to represent our internal and external environment, and that's what this refers to. And also we have to understand what we're choosing over. So what are the possible actions we can take? How do we currently feel? Which is obviously important. Are we hungry? Are we not hungry? Which should influence our food choices, for instance. And is there anything threatening that might prevent us from doing some of the actions? What are the risks involved, right? At the second level, then, we have evaluation process that takes place. So what is the value of the outcomes of our actions, or at least the estimated or predicted value of the outcomes? Let's say we're choosing over making a food choice of whether we want to have a quick snack at a very close and local shop nearby, or whether we want to have a fancy lunch that obviously is a bit more expensive, but also tastes better, and might involve, walking a short distance of a kilometer, but it's further. So there's some effort involved, there's some cost involved in the second section, and those are exactly the kinds of things that we compare in the valuation process. Finally, we have to select an action based on the evaluation that we came up with. So let's say we decided, okay, today we should treat ourselves to a better lunch and walk a little bit. So then the action we select is to actually start walking to the restaurant that's a little bit further away. Then we get to the restaurant and we order our favorite meal. And it turns out it's even better than expected. So that leads to a prediction error. So we predicted it to be good, but it actually is much better. So they improved the quality there. And this then leads to learning, which basically should make it more likely that in future valuations, we should choose the restaurant, because in this case, it turned out to be better than what we thought. So there's a prediction error that then enters a learning update, so an updated value, which will then enable us to make future predictions. We've also discussed how this plays out in the brain. So in a simple scenario like wanting to eat a sushi, a piece of sushi, in this case, we have a visual representation here, which is then forwarded to evaluation in the ventral medial, prefrontal cortex, and striatum, which we've seen a lot today. This then leads to motor planning in the motor cortex. Finally, we consume the item, and this is again within this region, the VMPFC ventral striatum, where we see correlates of outcome evaluation, and this is then updated in learning in the ventral striatum and possibly in the brainstem as well, where we see these kinds of, so the ventral tegmental area where the reward prediction error is processed, but also in the ventral striatum. So we have already, with these very simple steps, we have a widespread activation within the brain that we can observe. And it's a relatively complex decision to make that involves many different parts of the brain. Now, one thing that's important is that the authors, Rangel and colleagues, distinguish between different valuation systems. So they underline that there's a Pavlovian system, a habitual system, and a goal-directed system. And they're somewhat distinguishable, but in real life, this might be more of a continuum that and not so much a distinct sort of step between those three different systems. So the Pavlovian system we talked about when we talked about the Rescorla learning model, the Rescorla-Wegner learning model, when the animal, or we as well, learn associations between a stimulus and its value, and then exhibit behaviors such as approach behaviors that are hard-coded, basically. So when it comes to rewards, the Pavlovian system will make us eat all the food on the plate, and the reward we obtain then in that case is the food. So they're appetitive and avoidance or punishment-related responses. An avoidance-related response in the Pavlovian system is to cross the street upon seeing a dangerous person, and the punishment that's avoided then is the potential harm from the person. So the point of the Pavlovian system, it being hard-coded, is to make sure that we survive, right? So it makes sure that we approach positive, or we approach rewards, right? And that is eating the food, and that we avoid punishments, and that's avoiding potential dangers, such as a dangerous-looking person. Now, the habitual system is related to the instrumental conditioning paradigms that we talked about. So so things like trial and error learning, when it requires a few repetitions to establish a novel behavior that leads to rewards, or the avoidance of punishments. So this requires a little bit longer term learning, and it requires an action from the decision maker in this case. But once something is learned, it becomes habitual, and it becomes relatively automatic. So, for instance, making a morning cup of coffee, which requires a few steps. You have to grind the coffee, depending on how you make it. Then you have to boil some water. You pour the coffee into your coffee preparation device, and push the coffee down, for instance. So there are many steps involved in getting a morning cup of coffee, but the reward obtained in this case would be a stimulant, right? It's stimulating, that's rewarding. In fact, it leads to dopamine release in the brain as well. Then we might have avoidance type habitual learning, and that is, for instance, driving the usual route to work. The punishment avoided there is standing in traffic and being bored and sitting in the car. And then finally, the most complex system is a goal-directed system. It leads to more complex computations that require a prediction in novel situations. For instance, when we select a movie, we haven't seen the movie yet, so we don't know if we'll like it or not. But based on our previous experiences in similar settings, selecting movies in the past, we can make good predictions about whether the movie that we select leads to a reward and will entertain us. Similarly, goal-directed, overcoming laziness and going for a run leads to the avoidance of a number of punishments, namely obesity or unfitness, which are both obviously aversive. So it's important to distinguish between these three systems, according to the authors. But again, while there's evidence for each of these different systems, it has to be noted that they're most likely continuous, and they're interacting heavily with each other. So the habitual system, for instance, requires the Pavlovian system to identify what's rewards and punishments are. So does the goal-directed system. But as a sort of side note, the distinction between these systems is that they lie on a continuum between controlled versus automatic processes, with the most automatic one being the Pavlovian system, the habitual system then in the beginning being a controlled version of the Pavlovian system in a sense, but then becoming more and more automatic as you establish habits, as you learn habits. And finally, the goal-directed system, while it might rely on these two lower-level systems, it's the most controlled system in a sense. And also these distinctions can be seen in the brain, as this paper reminds us of. I just want to make these slides available to you to go through on your own time. But this is basically what I've said already. The Pavlovian system is an innate or hardwired system that assigns value to a small set of prepared behaviors. And that is basically approach foods when hungry, when it comes to primary rewards, or avoid punishments. And this may have important economic consequences because the value that the Pavlovian system assigns food might lead to overeating, and similarly, it might lead to obsessive compulsive disorder and those kinds of related behaviors. It can be interrupted by other systems, because obviously we can stop ourselves from overeating, but it is sometimes relatively difficult. And in terms of the neural basis, this system involves the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, and the orbitofrontal cortex, where the amygdala is particularly related to fear, but as we discussed in the emotion lecture already, the amygdala also relates to positive outcomes, and it cannot be assigned one specific behavioral correlate. The interaction with other systems is, well, it's not known. There's some work on Pavlovian instrumental transfer. So it's currently being researched, and it's an active area of research and continues to be so. Then we have the habit system, and here we're really talking about trial and error learning and instrumental conditioning, which we've also talked about in a previous lecture. So here we're talking to training and learning to assign values to a large set of actions. And these set of actions can actually be many steps, as in the coffee example, to eventually get to the reward that you wanted to get to. It's relatively slow because it requires trial and error, and this type of learning requires a constant updating over iterations and exposures to this environment or to this setting that you're learning about. It can generalize in novel situations, but not to the same extent that the goal-directed system can. But what it is it's the system that enables us to produce habits. But it's also something that we can update when we learn that our habits no longer lead to desired outcomes or actually start to have negative outcomes. And obviously, reinforcement learning and instrumental conditioning clearly requires the striatum and the ventral tegmental area, as we discussed earlier. So the reward prediction error is both a part of the Q-learning computational model, but also the Rescorla-Wagner model, and therefore relies somewhat on this on the ventral striatum and the ventral tegmental area within the brain. Finally, we have the goal-directed system, as I already said earlier. This is really computing action-outcome associations, so like when going to the movie, and making predictions about the reward value of certain actions in novel situations. So we're producing goal values and goal-directed behaviors in this system. And that's the system that we most commonly study in economics. And here, the goal system, in comparison to the other two systems, is able to update the value of an action. Let's say when the environment changes, and this could be our internal environment. So when we are fed to satiation, when we're no longer hungry, the goal-directed system will tell us to stop eating because we don't want to gain too much weight, whereas the Pavlovian system, or maybe the habitual system, will tell us to continue eating because it remembers the value of food being relatively high. Finally, as already mentioned previously, it's important to note that these systems, while most of the time they agree with each other, can also be in conflict on some occasions. So let's look at the habitual system being in conflict with the Pavlovian system. There are some studies that try to train animals to run away from food. So the animal actually gets rewarded more if it runs away from the food. So the appetitive Pavlovian system would assign a high value to move towards the food, to approach the food. That's the Pavlovian system. And then the habitual system then learns to assign a high value to run away from food. In fact, you cannot do this with pigeons. They cannot learn to, or they cannot be trained to move away from food, but you can do it with other animals. But it's relatively difficult because these two systems, the habitual system and the Pavlovian system, are in direct conflict there. Another one is to consider eating an extra bite or a dessert after being full. The appetitive Pavlovian system assigns a high value for the food, while the goal-directed system, depending on whether this is your goal, the health goal here would be there's a low value for extra food, a low value for having a bite of having a dessert after you're already being satiated because of the high sugar content. Clearly, that's not good for your body. So most of the time they're in agreement, but there are some situations when these different systems are not in agreement and leads to different outcomes in their computations or in their value estimates. So just to summarize what we've talked about today across all these three different, actually it's now multiple different subtopics. We've talked about the reward system, which is wonderfully illustrated in this figure here with the dopaminergic origins and substantia nigra, ventral tegmental area, which then project quite complex which form these complex projections to different parts in the striatum and then onto different parts in the prefrontal cortex. The one that we talk about most will be ventral tegmental area projections to the ventral part of the striatum, which then projects on further to ventromedial prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex. And there are other regions that are obviously involved in this, including the amygdala, the hippocampus, and we'll keep talking about this system throughout the in the forthcoming lectures. We've talked about the anticipation of rewards. We've talked about how the brain is involved in learning, the computation of the reward prediction error in the Schultz study, which we can see quite clearly in the neurons right here in the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area, that show this reward prediction error response, the surprise signal ramping up when something is better than expected and decreasing when something is worse than expected. And that's exactly what's predicted by this delta parameter here in this very simple Rescorla-Wagner learning model. It's also what we see in the brain of humans when they get a surprise positive outcome or a surprise negative outcome. And finally, we've talked about a model that incorporates all of these different aspects that are involved at minimum in decision making, and also incorporate this prediction error signal during outcome evaluation and learning. So it's this error here that involves the prediction error, and learning then leads to an updating. So that's this part here, the VT+1. So updating the value of the expected value of an action or a stimulus. If you're in the Pavlovian domain, it's a stimulus. If you're in the instrumental domain, it's an action value, in fact, for future valuation. So thank you again for your attention, and I wish you all the best, and see you in the next lecture.